So, this is Dr. Robert Bachman. This class is Psychology 375, Social Psychology. It's the first lecture. Um, I am recording lectures for the first time on PowerPoint, and it's taken me some time to figure that out, how to do it well, and no doubt it will improve over the course of the semester. So with this lecture, I intend to give you a brief introduction to social psychology and also an introduction to myself, in particular the things that are relevant to me being a social psychologist. So you are, in fact, getting taught by a social psychologist. And look, there on the first slide, I've managed to misspell my name, so there I'm not perfect. The IQ is a feature of my lectures that IQ stands for Intriguing Question, and what I like to do is just pose a question to you. It's not for points or anything, but it's just to get you to think about the material. And the IQ for today is, what social psychological process have you engaged in today? So as you've been reading the text and after listening to this lecture, I'd like you to reflect on your own experience and think about what parts of that experience relate to the focus of social psychology. So to begin with, why do I love social psychology? When I was an undergraduate like yourself, particularly just starting out, I thought, psychology is about people helping other people who have problems. They are depressed, or they are, have anxiety, or they're having substance abuse problems, or something like that. I thought that psychology was really just clinical psychologists, and I didn't really have an idea that there were other kinds of psychologists. And one of the things I learned about soon after I began studying psychology is that social psychology is a form of psychology that takes the study of human behavior outside of the clinic and into the everyday world. And that's one of the things I really loved about it, is that it applied to my everyday life. In everyday life, there are both social assets and liabilities of being a social animal. Human beings are definitely social beings, or as biologists would say, gregarious creatures. We huddle together in groups. We are uncomfortable being alone. As an animal, we're much like other gregarious species, fish, herds of sheep, cows, and unlike animals that aren't gregarious, that live basically solitary lives unless they need to mate. Human beings are definitely social creatures. And some of the assets of that social nature is that, starting with the very powerful bonds of our first social relationships within our families, we enter into a lifetime contract of interdependence with others that brings us both security and joy and happiness. And also, those are some of the assets, definitely. We rely on others to help us. We feel happy when we help others. We get entertainment and benefit of various kinds from interacting with others. But there are also some problems, some liabilities in social life. Even though social psychologists mostly study normal, healthy individuals and everyday behavior, sometimes there are unpleasant aspects of those everyday behaviors. So interdependence can also bring frustrations, conflict and aggression, injustice, depression from alienation. Sometimes our social life just doesn't bring us what we need to get from others, and that is one of the fundamental liabilities of social life. In my approach to social psychology, what I'd like you to do is to think about how social psychology applies to everyday life, and at the same time respect that social psychologists have a certain degree of precision and detail than you typically apply to understanding your everyday life. So be cautious of assuming that because something is kind of familiar in our subject matter of social psychology that you already know it. Social psychologists have specific definitions for things, and we have specific findings from our research and our theories. Some of those findings may line up with your experience, and other findings may actually contradict or qualify, put parameters around what is typically observed in your social life. So with each lecture, I'll typically give a brief chapter outline. That is, the lecture will focus on a particular chapter or a portion of a chapter that corresponds to the reading schedule in your syllabus, and that'll just kind of give you a sense of where we're headed. So today we're going to focus on what social psychology is. I'll give you a couple definitions, some of which are in the text, some of which aren't. We'll cover some major theoretical perspectives that are presented in the first text, and then begin to look at some basic principles of social psychology. So what is social psychology? There's many different perspectives on social life and many different approaches to studying social behavior. But social psychology is different insofar as, first, it's a psychological approach. And psychology is a science. That's important to remember. And psychology as a science focuses on behavior. We're trying to understand behavior. Behavior is defined as some observable actions that you can see. But also in psychology, we observe, measure, etc., things that are a bit more difficult to directly observe. So we're studying the behavior, which are those the observable actions, a person picking up a pencil, a person picking a fight, a person kissing another person, a person punching someone, a person stealing from another person. These are all things we can easily see. But we also study the mind. So here we're talking about sensations, perceptions, memories, thoughts, our motives and emotions, and other subjective experiences. How is that person feeling? It may not be obvious. What is their attitude towards a particular political issue? These things are less easy to observe directly. But nonetheless, social psychologists and psychologists in general have figured out ways to measure these things. So, social psychology is the scientific study of how people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by other people. That's the textbook definition. So the subject matter of social psychology is social life and how individuals experience and influence their social world. Many different studies, different areas study that subject matter, but from different perspectives. So how about another definition of social psychology? This one is not in your textbook, but I think it's a really good definition. It's by Gordon Allport. As you can see from the date there, it's quite an old definition, but it's an important one, I think, to share with you. Gordon Allport tells us that social psychology is an attempt to understand and explain how the thought, feeling, and behavior of individuals are influenced by real, imagined, or implied presence of others. So my point in sharing this with you is to highlight that sometimes our behavior is influenced by social psychological forces and pressures, even when no one is present. Even when we are by ourselves, social psychological forces are influencing our behavior. So imagine, if you will, you're walking down the hall, and no one's around, it's just you alone, and you see a $20 bill on the floor. And assume this is a public place, like at the library or something like that. And you pick up that $20 bill, and I'm going to argue that you will immediately begin thinking about what to do with that $20 bill. Do you slip it into your pocket? If you did that with the intention of keeping it, would you feel guilty? Would you feel deserving of that $20? Maybe you lost $20 yourself. Would you feel like, hey, I've got to walk this over to the lost and found and hand it over to someone, so in case somebody comes looking for it, they'll be able to find it? Any of these responses, I would argue, is a result of imagined or implied presence of others. You have in your learning history a set of expectations about what acceptable or normal or what kind of behavior you should or ought to engage in, and that is the influence of other people, even if they're not present in that moment. So what about some of the subject matter of social psychologists? We study a wide variety of things. This is just a little sampling. We look at attraction, both attraction between friends and attraction between potential love relation partners. We look at social influence, how people might try to get you to buy something, how some people might get you to vote for a particular thing, sign this petition, buy this product, go camping with me versus go camping with someone else. We look at discrimination. That might be discrimination based on sex. That might be on social status, poor people, rich people. It might be ethnicity, Alaska Natives, Asian Americans, African Americans, discrimination against white people for that matter. We look at conflict and aggression, stereotypes. We look at peace and also justice kinds of concerns, social and political attitudes, social problems and their solutions. In fact, one of the major assignments in this course is for you to apply social psychological theory and research findings to solving some sort of problem that is really social psychological in nature. The problem is caused by social psychological factors, and the solution to that problem is also found in social psychological solutions that you propose. So probably one of the most important principles in social psychology is the idea that social situations that we find ourselves in, such as this cafe displayed, are a stronger determinant of our social behavior than our personalities. Our personalities are certainly important, and they can change how one person reacts to a powerful situation compared to another person's reaction. And we call that combination of the situation influence and personality influence an interaction. That is, the combination of who you are as an individual and the influences you're experiencing in a situation cause your behavior. That kind of unique combination of who you are and where you find yourself and the influences in that situation is an interaction. And it's a very important principle, basic principle in social psychology. So once again, social psychologists maintain that the power of the situation is the most important determinant of behavior, but how people respond to the situation is an interaction with their individual personalities. So here in this situation we see people sitting and eating, and I would argue that they're not doing other kinds of behaviors because that's the kind of behavior that's expected, or the kind of behavior that a person's influenced to engage in that setting of a cafe or a cafeteria. So the power of the situation, digging a little deeper there. What we're talking about is the presence of others, so physical presence of others. It has a powerful impact on our behavior, also on the kinds of thoughts that we are having and the feelings that we're having. And as I said a moment ago, it tends to overwhelm personality factors. We also are involved in the situation insofar as we interpret the situation. That's kind of our individuality bringing to the situation a particular interpretation of that situation. Each person might interpret the situation slightly differently. It's also the case that when we enter into a situation, to some extent we change the nature of that social situation by adding to it with our own individual presence. So there's a reciprocal influence. If there are three people sitting and talking to each other, that's a social situation. The situation is influencing the behavior of those three individuals. Along comes a fourth person, and they enter that situation, and maybe by virtue of who they are, what their personality is like, suddenly the situation changes, and the behavior of the four individuals that are now in that situation is a function of that reciprocal influence. The person who joined the group is being influenced by that situation, but he or she in turn is impacting or changing the situation with their presence. And that interaction is that reciprocal influence there as well. The last thing I want to mention for now about social psychology is that it tends to focus on what we might call a normal behavior. This is our research and our theory tends to focus on what is the most common or dominant response to a situation. So even though there may be some individual differences, one personality might behave differently than another personality, the emphasis is on, well, what do most people do in that situation? So if you were to enter a restaurant, most people would, after being seated, sit quietly and wait for the waitress to take their order, and then eat and behave the way that most people do. Now, some people might come into a restaurant and decide to dance on a table, but that's not the common or typical response to a dining room setting. To further emphasize this idea of interaction, now I'd like to point out something. It's not in your textbook. Kurt Lewin is an early social psychologist who came to America after escaping Nazi Germany. He was a Jewish man. And when he came to America, he was part of an effort to make psychology become more of a scientific discipline. And as such, he, at least in this particular theory, I would argue, engaged in a little bit of physics envy. Not penis envy, but physics envy, insofar as they were trying to adopt concepts and ideas from the hard sciences to help invigorate theoretical and empirical approaches to understanding human behavior. So in this diagram, we have Kurt Lewin's field theory illustrated. What he's arguing is that human behavior is a response to various force fields, and those force fields are and how they interact are summarized. They occur in a life space and summarized in the equation that you see at the bottom right. B stands for human behavior, and F stands for function. So it's basically saying human behavior is a function of, and then let's review what P and E mean on the next slide. But before we do, let's just briefly unpack this diagram slightly. So the green lines are very broad influences. The yellow arrow there you see is kind of the trajectory or the human behavior that's being explained here. And so those broad greenish lines are pushing the behavior in that general direction. And then the smaller circles that you see there are perhaps individuals that have influences on us. So the broad lines might be the broad situation or the culture. The blue lines might be another individual in a person's life that's influencing him or her to behave in a particular way. And the orange circles are the personality of the individual whose behavior is being explained, or the arrow going over to the right. So according to Kurt Lewin and his field theory of human behavior, behavior is a function of the person, so in our diagram before, that's the little orange circles, in interaction with the environment. And the environment here is other individuals. That's part of our social environment, but it's also broader influences like the culture and the time that we live in. So this is back to that basic principle of interaction. Behavior is a function of the person or their individuality or their personality in interaction with the environment, the social situation. In our text, there's a lot of emphasis on interaction, and that makes sense because that's a basic principle in social psychology. As I said, by person, psychologists mean the features or characteristics that individuals carry from social situation to social situation. So when you woke up this morning, you have your individual characteristics. You take them to your shopping destination, you take them to your workplace, you take them to the conversation you have with your roommate or your spouse or relationship partner. That individuality goes with you wherever you go, either in physical space or into different social interactions. By situation, psychologists are talking about the environmental events or circumstances outside the person. So the fact that when you walk into your kitchen, your roommate's there, that's a situation. The fact that when you go to drive to the supermarket, there's a traffic jam, that's an environmental event. You get into the supermarket, the cashier is very friendly with you and courteous, and that's an environmental event. These are circumstances outside the person, and your behavior is really a combination or an interaction between who you are, and you take from place to place, and those situational influences. There are 6 different ways, many different ways, but 6 different ways that the textbook characterizes interaction. You need to remember them. They summarize the main ways in which people interact with their environment. And the symbol in the upper left of our slide here shows a circle of individuals around a single individual in the center, and that's our symbol for interaction. It's when the person, that's the yellow person in the middle, is interacting with the situation. So let's see here, 6 different ways. So we might have different people responding differently to the same situation. So for example, you may see a party as a welcome chance to make new friends, and when you go to the party, that's the way you start approaching it. Another person may see or interpret the same party as a very stressful ordeal. Okay? So both situations are the same situation insofar as it's a party. One individual really enjoys the party, another, say more introverted individual, may find the party as kind of stressful and something that he or she might want to avoid. So different people respond differently to the same situation. Secondly, situations choose the person. So there's certainly the case that not all social situations, not all environments are equally accessible to all people. So for example, a tall person is more likely to be encouraged to play basketball by coaches and teachers and friends, and a small person might be more likely to be chosen to be a gymnast. Okay? Similarly, a very assertive person might be chosen to be a salesperson, and a very timid person might not be selected for that kind of job. A third example is that persons choose their situations. So, for example, a person who really likes action movies is much more likely to be found at a violent action movie than a person who doesn't like those kinds of things, who might choose a different type of movie altogether. So in that movie situation, we might see a different set of people because people choose the situations that they occupy. Okay, different situations prime different parts of the person. An example here might be that around your person, before we get started with that, let's introduce that idea of priming. That's a topic, a concept that social psychologists often use. It's not necessarily used by everyone. So to prime means to bring into attention. So when we bring into attention, we focus our attention, or we bring it into consciousness, that's what we mean by priming. So when we say different situations prime different parts of the person, we're saying a situation will remind a person or bring into conscious awareness a part of the person that might not ordinarily be at the forefront of their awareness. So, for example, around your professor, you may show your intellectual side, and around an old friend who did not go to college, you may suppress that part and maybe have some other aspect of yourself be prime, something you have in common, such as skiing. So around a professor, your intellectual side is brought into awareness, and you demonstrate that in your behavior and your interaction with your professor, and in your behaviors around fellow students, for example. Whereas when you interact with or you enter a situation with your old ski buddies, maybe the part of you that's a good skier or enjoys skiing is more part of your awareness and exhibits in your behavior. Number 5, persons change the situation. For example, a highly extroverted person can change a boring party into a social event that many people remember because suddenly it becomes more exciting and more entertaining. Situations can change the person. For example, people respond to their cultural situations sometimes by taking action and being politically or socially active. For example, right now in Anchorage, there are many people responding to the social situation of budget cuts at the Anchorage School District by protesting them and writing letters to the editor and attending meetings. And that might actually, over time, cause a person to be more of a social activist. Recently, we also had Alaska Civil Rights Day, and that's an example of how a predominant situation changed the person into being more of a civil rights activist. So how do social psychologists study social behavior? This is the first part. We'll talk about it a little bit more extensively in our next lecture. Social psychology, like any science, involves two general methods. One is description, where we make careful and reliable observations and describe what we observe in the world. And the other is explanation. Here the emphasis is on the development of theories that connect and organize observations, but there's also importantly an emphasis on trying to explain the cause and effect sequence in between variables. And I want to point out that there is no one correct theory in a description of social behavior. They're often evolving. So there can be multiple theories that explain the same behavior. One theory may do a better job of explaining one set of facts. Another theory may do a better job of explaining some other facts or observations. But it's also the case that theories are constantly being revised based upon new evidence. And when we talk about theoretical perspectives, you'll see a bit more of this point, that not only are theories evolving, but they also have different merit depending upon how they focus on certain explanatory mechanisms. So theories are scientific explanations that help us connect and organize existing observations. So on that score, it's sort of like, unlike an everyday theory where you might say, oh, I have a theory that blah, blah, blah. In a scientific theory, what we are really doing is taking the results of many empirical, that is scientific studies of the same phenomenon, and we observe consistent patterns in the results of those findings. So let's say there's 50 studies done and 40 of them more or less reach the same conclusion. Well, then we begin to say, well, because the predominance or the majority of the evidence is supporting this particular relationship or this particular cause and effect sequence, then we're going to begin saying, well, we have confidence that that's quote-unquote true about human behavior. And then the next step is to sort of organize that and make any sort of changes or qualifications on that based on, again, patterns in the data. When there are differences based on, say, how old a person is, or what gender they are, or certain personality characteristics, then that's part of the organization to say, well, this is generally true, but for this type of person, it's less true or it's more true. That's part of a scientific theory, is organizing what the majority of findings are all about, and then making those qualifications if the pattern of observations support that. In addition, theories are explanations that suggest fruitful paths for future research. So a theory may have a set of hypotheses. These are assertions about what should be true if the theory is correct, and then additional research can verify verify those hypotheses, or if the case is that those hypotheses are not supported, suggest changes to the theory or revisions to the theory. So the major theoretical perspectives that are highlighted in our textbook and are seen throughout the whole text, and we'll return to them more explicitly at the very last chapter, are social cultural, evolutionary, social learning, and social cognitive. And we'll go through an example of each of these in a moment. So the social cultural perspective, this is the theoretical viewpoint that searches for the causes of social behavior and the influences from larger social groups. So for example, we might say that the behavior of students in Anchorage, Alaska, or Wasilla for that matter, or wherever you're studying from, are a function of what is normal or typically expected for students in the United States or in Alaska for that matter. So we're saying that the broader culture of Alaska or the broader culture of the United States influences how students behave in their social interactions with their instructors. So according to these folks, these forces from larger groups such as norms from cultural groups, social class differences, nationality, ethnicity, even trending fads. Like, I want to take my class by interacting through my cell phone. These are influences on social behavior. Social cultural theorists might ask such questions as, what are the differences in social behavior across culture? Do some cultures behave differently in social settings than other cultures? A social norm, just as a reminder, it's a definition in your book. It's a rule or expectation for appropriate social behavior. If we are violating a social norm, other people will remind us by telling us that we're being inappropriate or giving us a nasty look or worse. Culture is the broader organization or collection of beliefs and customs and norms that are shared by a group of people living in a particular time and place. So as I said before, in the United States we have a culture. We have a mix of cultures, but nonetheless there's a predominant culture that people can identify. And even within that broader culture there are subcultures. So we could say Alaskans have a culture that's maybe a little bit different than people in California. So here's a research example. I'm not actually going to speak much to this. You can study this research example in your textbook a bit more closely. But the main point to be made here is that this socio-cultural perspective is brought to bear in this research. They're basically saying that within American culture, most kids are taught to sort of cherish their own individual choice, their independence, think outside of the box is an expression you often hear. But in Asian culture, there's more of an emphasis on ensuring that people's behavior lines up with what's good for the group, what's good for parents and elders, and the self in this perspective is viewed as more interdependent with family and social groups. So rather than being independent, people are more of an emphasis on being interdependent. And so in this study, they look at American kids, but they look at Caucasian Americans and Asian American kids, and they observe that a child's puzzle-solving behavior in a situation in a laboratory seems to be influenced or interact with their cultural background. So the puzzles were chosen by a child, chosen by an experimenter, or chosen by the child's mom. And the number of puzzles that the students did in the amount of time, so it's not really the speed, but basically their motivation, how much they were motivated to complete the puzzles, seems to follow a pattern that suggests that Anglo-American children do the puzzles more if they chose them, whereas the Asian American kids do more of the puzzles if their moms chose them. You see that here in this slide. An evolutionary perspective is the theoretical perspective that searches for the causes of social behavior and the physical and psychological predispositions that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. So I want to make a point here that I know some of you may have religious views that are not, that don't support the evolutionary perspective, and that's fine. I respect that. But I do want to say that I still want you to understand how the evolutionary theoretical perspective works, how they think about human behavior and why it's caused. So here we're saying that, or the evolutionary perspective argues that in our historical context, thousands of years ago or millions of years ago, the psychological behaviors or predispositions that helped us survive and helped us be good parents and helped our offspring survive are behavioral inclinations or behavioral tendencies that have been selected for and retained in our gene pool and influence our current behavior. So, as I was just saying, according to these folks, what drives social behavior are these genetic predispositions that prompted survival and reproduction, such as the tendency to automatically recognize an angry face. Why might that psychological ability be selected for? I mean, why might we have that tendency now, whereas in the past that may not have been as prevalent? Well, think about it. If a person had the psychological capacity to recognize an angry face, well, that might be helpful because you avoid that person who has the angry face, whereas a person without that ability would probably be at risk for being aggressed against and may actually have lower chances of survival. There's another one here that's a little bit more obvious in terms of reproduction. The tendencies for mothers to feel protective of their children, to be bonded with them. That natural tendency to feel bonded to their child and protective of their child, that would help their offspring help them survive in a harsh historical environment. Those mothers who didn't have that protective impulse, well, their kids didn't survive, so their genes didn't get passed on. So critical to the idea of the evolutionary perspective is the idea of natural selection. It's a process by which characteristics, psychological tendencies in this case, that help animals survive and reproduce are passed on to their offspring. So animals with features suited to the demands of the environment, and that can also be a social environment, will survive better than those with less well-adapted features. Those well-adapted animals will reproduce more successfully also. So another concept here is adaptation. This is a characteristic that's well designed for survival and reproduction in a particular environment. One thing that's important to recognize here when we talk about adaptation is these are just sort of variations that are existing in a natural mix of things, and that characteristic or variation of characteristics, those that seem to work well for survival and reproductions, are the ones that are retained in the gene pool. So it's not so much designed as it's a variation that is out there, and because it works, it is retained in the gene pool, whereas the ones that are dysfunctional and don't work, those variations tend to get weeded out. So in evolutionary perspective, those theorists sometimes ask questions such as, are there similarities in social behaviors across species? And also, are there similarities in social behavior across culture and historical period? And that second question is perhaps more relevant to what social psychologists often focus on. If we see broad similarities in social behavior across cultures and across historical periods, then we're more inclined to believe that that characteristic, that psychological tendency, is something that we have inherited rather than something that is just a function of our response to a particular culture or historical period. The social learning perspective basically argues that our past learning experiences are determinants of a person's current behaviors. So if you're currently sitting attentive in class, paying attention, or sitting at your desk carefully following this lecture, that behavior is probably a function of how you've been rewarded in the past for paying attention to some educational content. If you haven't had that past learning experience, being rewarded for focusing on your lecture material, then you might behave differently. So according to these folks, a couple of broad influences on our behavior are classically conditioned preferences. So you have a boss or a brother or a sister who you've had conflicts with in the past, and you've maybe had physical altercations, and when you feel fear at the sight of that person, it's a function of that pairing between that person and that unpleasant experience in the past. So your social behavior of feeling a fear or avoiding that person is a function of your reinforcement history with that person. We can also have our behavior influenced by the habits that are rewarded by other people. For example, a boy who fights frequently might be doing that because his father praises him or rewards him for fighting with a neighborhood bully. Like good boy. You took care of that nasty old bully. I'm going to take you out for a milkshake for taking care of business there. Well, it turns out that that boy becomes a bit of an avenger because his father has encouraged him through that reinforcement. So yeah, what drives social behavior according to this perspective are classically conditioned habits that are directly rewarded, and lastly, and perhaps most importantly, given the name here, is a social learning process where we actually imitate the rewarded behavior of others. This is a bit of an odd example here, but if you have frequently observed a person being rewarded for some kind of heroic act, then you might engage in similar forms of heroism yourself. To use a less dramatic example, if you see a student being encouraged and supported by an instructor who frequently asks questions or shows that they've done the reading, then you might engage in questioning behavior or doing the reading before class because you've seen another person have success with that behavior. So that's called social learning, in that you don't have to directly be rewarded. You actually observe the reward going to another person and engage or imitate that behavior because of that. So here's an example of social learning perspective where a team of researchers hypothesized that a violent video game might make a person feel rewarded for aggressive behavior, and in particular it allows the person to win points, that's the reward, for killing and maiming human-like opponents. And in this study they found that they did a comparison between students who had been exposed to and played a violent video game or a non-violent video game, and then when they played a competitive game afterwards, they found that those who had played the violent video game were more violent in their retaliation against real opponents, using a simulation of violence, which was an unpleasantly loud blast of noise directed at the opponent. And you see that in the difference in these two graphs here. So a social cognitive perspective is a very important perspective for social psychology. Lots of research done here. This is the theoretical viewpoint that focuses on the mental processes that are involved in paying attention to, interpreting, and remembering social experiences. So basically our social behavior is determined by these mental or cognitive processes. So according to these folks, what drives our social behavior is what we focus our attention on, how we interpret what we see and focus our attention on, and how we judge those social situations, and finally what we retrieve from memory. And these three things are very interrelated. What we focus on will guide what we end up interpreting, and our interpretation will lead to a particular judgment, and finally, after the situation's over, we'll remember certain things about that social situation based on what we paid attention to and how we interpreted and how we responded. what we retrieve from memory then becomes what we bring to the next situation. So as an example of that memory process, people who notice the behaviors of group members who are in a minority might tend to exaggerate the significance of the things that we do. Just a moment. I'm going to look at this next slide here. An example of social cognition is you can look at this YouTube video and see how social cognition is influencing people's interpretation of the world. So let's just quickly review then how each of these perspectives focus on different aspects of the causes of social behavior. Social cultural perspective looks for causes of social behavior in the forces from larger social groups. Evolutionary perspective looks to our genetic predispositions, and those genetic predispositions are those that promoted our ancestors' survival and reproduction. Social learning is kind of combining a lot of different types of learning theories, classically conditioned, operant conditioned behavior, and social learning processes which involve imitation. And finally, the social cognitive perspective says that what we pay attention to and how we interpret what we focus on and how we judge those or make judgments or decisions based on those interpretations, and finally what we retrieve from memory, all are important influences on behavior. So I'm going to take an end to the slides here and ask you to carefully review the syllabus and think about how one or more of these different behaviors that are listed here would be explained by those 4 different theoretical perspectives, and think about whether one theoretical perspective would probably do a better job than the other theoretical perspectives of explaining one type of behavior. So for example, is gang violence best described by the social cognitive behavior, the social cognitive theory, or the evolutionary theory, or social learning? What is the perspective that you think best explains one of these behaviors here?